Welcome to Great Karate Myths, Debunking the Legends, the podcast where we cut through the confusion and get to the core of what karate really is. Today we're diving deep into a term you might have heard but perhaps don't fully understand, Ko-do Ryu. What exactly is it? Where did it come from? And what does it mean for the modern martial artist? We'll be exploring the origins and the true essence behind this unique approach to karate, setting the stage for future discussions on its practical application. Stick around as we unveil the story of Ko-do Ryu. Welcome, gentlemen. Okay, so we're going to be talking about what is Ko-do Ryu. And so, Nathan, we're going to start with you.
It's going to fall to me as the founder. I'm the culprit. Okay, well, you were actually around when I mooted it. We were on a coach, and I think we were going through Lleida in Spain. Our good friend Nigel's wedding, and Nigel's friend, who became our friend, was on the coach with his Japanese wife. His wife was from Japan, so I got the opportunity to check the pronunciation of the intended name change of our group. It looks like Ko, but it's Ko. They did advise me on the pronunciation, in which I was later able to confirm with my publisher and various other people. But it was hinted at before the publication of Barefoot Zen in 2000, where I put partway through the book, I said in brackets that, I really felt that I was a practitioner of what I defined as Ko-do Tote, bit of a mouthful for a non-native speaker. The whole idea was to define the art as being an old way, because we were looking at antique kata and deploying them, studying them, or modified antique kata. And so the idea was to allude to the fact that this was pushing hands, and the kata that we were using could be termed old way. And the tote really was another definition of a China hand, giving a nod, as they say, to the Chinese origin of the material. So we had the old way of China hand, which is a very crude way of translating it. Yeah, the change happened between, we were still Zen Shorindo in 2000, but between 2000 and 2004, we became Ko-do Ryu. That's close. Certainly by the publication of The Great Karate Myth in 2006. By then we were Ko-do Ryu. Another connection, there are a couple of more interesting connections with the use of Ko-do Tote or Ko-do Ryu. Ryu really just refers to a sort of a roughly put a family or a group. I'm not a native Japanese speaker, but the idea or parts of the association was with the Jigoro Kano, the founder of Judo. His style or group is Judo school. Judo was the soft way, do being way, and Ju being soft or flowing, or however you want to interpret it, depending on the context. And what Kano Jigoro did was he then referred to his Judo in terms of where it was practiced. So that became Kodokan Judo. So it became Kodokan, and that was that particular original brand of Judo. And I very much valued the idea of the Kodo, the old way, even though Kano Jigoro's Judo was actually new. It was a translation of, or a development of Jiu-Jitsu, in the same way that Ko-do Ryu is a development of Chinese pushing hands and grappling. And what I put together was an approach that needed to express these kata was some form of randori. So Judo has randori. Randori was the sort of preparatory, the sort of shuffling around that they do prior to going for a throw, or occasionally a lock or a takedown. And that's referred to as randori. It's sort of Judo's version of sparring. And I chose to use the pushing hands format as a medium, as a form of randori for our karate. So it would be the medium through which we would be able to produce the techniques and create the challenges for things like grip escapes, or applying locks and tie-ups and so on. That was the general idea. And I think the boast was that we could produce a technique, we could apply a technique from the kata that we used, namely the Sanchin Rokushu, which most people know as Tensho. We could apply one of the techniques exactly as it appears in the kata, but without prearranging and without having to rely on a punch over a gap, an oizuki. Another massive advantage was that it could be done in contact, which meant that we could make use of the vastly superior contact reflexes, which are the fastest type of reflexes, arguably, that we have.
So that's the background to the name. What is it that we do, Tom?
It all centers around kata. And starting with the antique forms, the forms inherited from China that have found their way to Okinawa. And the principal aim of the group was to try to find out what those forms were originally for. And over the course of time, that sort of process has unfolded, and different kata have been unraveled, and Nathan's published his findings in his books. And you can see that the progression of the research there as well. A lot of other work has been done as well, which exists within the practitioners of the group. And what emerged are two main approaches to kata, which is one is to seek the original functions, and the other is creative interpretation, which we've talked about in a past podcast. And so really the practice in the group is divided between looking at the original functions of the kata and Nathan's creatively interpreted karate, really, which is kind of all held together with the pushing hands. So there's Sanchin Rokushu, pushing hands, and that's the creatively interpreted aspect. And then you step into the Naihanshin, which is the lead into the original functions. And I think I think we may be one of the only karate groups in the world that actually takes that approach. And I've never encountered anyone else that's stated that they're seeking the original functions of kata. And I think that's what makes our group quite different, is that we don't try to accumulate applications or lots and lots of theories or layers or anything like that. What we are seeking is what was really intended when these forms were put together, and what was the culture and that they grew out of, and what inspired their creation and things like that. So trying to answer or to get some idea of an answer to those types of questions, rather than what could we do with this kata. That happens in the kind of creative interpretation and things, but in terms of the antique forms, it's about really understanding what were they originally for. And as I've already said, I think that's what really sets us. We're quite different from other karate groups.
Yeah, and I think a starting point from that is to outright dismiss modern self-defense technique.
Yeah.
That interpretation of self-defense, to have that first rule that it's not for that. So what is it for?
Yeah. And I think it's because it's just an assumption, isn't it? It's an assumption that's made that all the kata, all the antique forms were for one thing, and that they're all interchangeable, and they all kind of, are all representations of different scenarios. They're not. There's lots and lots of different functions for these forms, and it's really interesting just to even set aside, like you've just suggested, set aside self-defense. Say, well, what else could it be? What could I do with the limited content of one of these forms? What potential does it hold really for any kind of martial skill or anything like that? And that's what we're striving for. And it takes just as kind of, it's not like it takes years and years to do it as well. It's not been the research side of things. I mean, it's not simply that we've rolled the dice and Nathan discovered that Sanchin, the original Sanchin, was Sai. It's gone through many, many different ideas and theories and lots of different avenues. And that's what makes it interesting as well. And some of those things might come up in later podcasts as well, where we talk about experiences of following a line of inquiry with an antique form and it being completely wrong. I know I can speak to that if anyone's interested. It took me I could just speak from my own experience, and then Nathan will jump in with his. I worked for a very, very long time on Kusanku, and for 3 years I was so far off what it was. And it was the frustration that I couldn't take that any further, that it led into something else. So it's a very interesting approach as well. And I think that's what, it's kept me really, really interested in karate and kata in particular. It's so much more interesting to pursue were these forms originally intended for, rather than, well, what can I do with them today? That's my own personal view.
That's what you wrote in the Great Karate Myth, Nathan. You wrote the definition of Ko-do Tote and the limbs that it has.
I'm going to do this accurately. A definition of Ko-do Tote. Ko-do Tote has 2 limbs, each with 3 branches. Okay, this is how I've defined it. Limb 1, Ko-do was not intended for use on the battlefield. Number 2, Ko-do was not designed to be openly used against a professional warrior or a trained opponent. However, practice with skilled training partners is inevitable and necessary for the development of proficiency. Ko-do was not intended to be used in an arena or in a sporting contest. So that's limb number 1. Limb 2, Ko-do creates and contains holistic fitness and acts as a form of recreation. Number 2, Ko-do facilitates introspection or meditation and spiritual cultivation, standing or moving Zen. Number 3, Ko-do facilitates effective confidence, character, and citizen building through training based on rigorous ritual combative experience aimed at cultivating and improving the individual and those with whom he or she associates. So I would therefore summarize the value of Ko-do Tote, classified under the following 3 headings. 1, as a method of exercise and recreation. 2, as a method of self-discipline and spiritual training. 3, as a method of personal ennoblement and a way to develop and maintain physical prowess. That was pretty much a definition I still adhere to today.
I think one of the benefits that comes out of Ko-do Ryu karate in training in the way that you've just described, Nathan, is that without the idea of you're preparing for any kind of fight or anything like that, with that element removed, it makes it into something completely different. And I think you could only have those qualities that you've described if you're not preparing for a fight. I think if you start preparing for fights or self-defense, then you can kind of throw out a lot of that.
I can vouch for that. When I first arrived when it was Chandao Wing Chun, I was just so relieved it was completely not about the combat thing, the fighting thing. It was just totally refreshing to do something completely different. And I thought it was just completely different. I've never encountered anything like that, so that's why I stuck with it.
Yeah, Kev, you've been involved with the group since it was Chandao Kung Fu.
Yeah, it was 1990. Yeah,
the idea has always been the same. The names change. The idea and the concept and the ethos and the philosophy's always been the same. That hasn't changed.
Yeah, it's consistent. It's totally good. Yeah, that's good. Like I remember Nathan working out Naihanshi. Remember that, seeing that in I think it was Southampton. You were doing that early 90s. Yeah, I remember that as well. And just putting that together, that's quite a tricky thing to do, to deconstruct a kata that's taught as a defense against multiple attackers and it clearly isn't. It's like, wow. Yeah.
Well, that research changed as we learned more. Actually, we made a transition from Kung Fu to karate. We'll save that for the next one. I remember being roundly criticised in the early, I think around about 2006, but by people writing things like, Johnson's now decided everything's about weapons. Can't he make up his mind? So my first book was called Zen Shaolin Karate. It was published by Charles E. Tuttle in Tokyo. It's quite a prestigious company, but can't say I was excited by the cover or by the title choice, because I wanted Zen Shorindo. I did not want Zen Shaolin Karate, because I felt that Shaolin and karate was a mismatch. I wanted Zen Shorindo, but the publisher didn't think that people would understand, what that was. So they chose to use the title Shaolin. If I look at that book, which was published in 1994, I believe, certainly by 2000, we developed so much in that period of time that the 2000 book, Barefoot Zen, which was published by Samuel Weiser, had a lot of the new material, and we developed more. We're like any human being. As you change, as you learn more. But we had empirical evidence for the functions of the kata, something that still continues to this day. So Tom he's continued. He's worked with Chinto and Kushanku and Basai, and I believe he's got those. And once again, as he just said earlier, he worked for it on 3 years and then had to go back to the drawing board, revise it all. The thing is, that is how any kind of research progresses. And obviously, as you learn more, then any publications you make are going to demonstrate that the increase in knowledge. And again, I repeat, the evidence that we have is empirical. It can be seen in the kata. And I'll just say one more thing here. We were also accused of zealotry, of being zealots, and big claim makers, that we made big claims. But who do these people think they are? But they think they know what the Japanese don't know. Well, I don't want to say anything negative about Japanese karate. But in my own lifetime, if I now look at, apart from the discoveries which we've got, which are accurate, in my lifetime, the standard Naihanshin, or the application, came through the Shotokan school, the Japanese Shotokan school, in which Tsunakoshi Jichin Sensei, the founder of Shotokan, or rather, he's the one who his students named the style after, he changed the name from Naihanshin to Teki. One of his students, who the then chief instructor of the Japan Karate Association, or the infamous JKA out of Tokyo and global, called, I think, Best Karate, he published sort of all of the Shotokan kata, and he published what the JKA did for applications, and they're discredited now. But they were the standard, where Naihanshin was used to block and counter multiple opponents on a gap, but strangely moving sort of only left and right. It's quite strange to watch. You don't see it very often these days, but a Google search will probably throw it up for you. If you look at Best Karate or Nagamine Shoshin, or look for the 1980 Japan Karate Association applications of Teki kata, you'll find them. Those have been largely discredited now, and everybody moved on to other things. I certainly was in the early days of that, and people they tried pressure points and, trying to justify Naihanshin in many, many different ways. And one or two of our, quotes, competitors partially accepted our view that it was grappling, but then didn't understand the sequential nature of it, or how the kata unfolded, or actually basically what it was for. So, they take a move and say, well, this looks like a headlock. So, okay, we agree with Johnson et al. That it's grappling, but I think this bit here is a headlock, and this bit here is a kick to the kneecap, and so on. But it moved from the received idea of block, strike with some very strange looking strikes, to people beginning to accept that wasn't what it was for. And it's moved radically let's give this a timeline. So it's moved really radically since about 1995. It's really moved, and we're no longer seen as being completely out there, and more people are accepting what we've done. And a final thing, we were called zealots because detractors just wanted to say, why are you insisting that your version is the version? As though you're actually, that's an unholy thing to think. It's arrogant and egotistical. You and only you have the true version. We know that people just have versions. Who do you think you are, you Ko-do Ryu people? You're claiming to know what the Okinawans aren't telling us.
It's interesting that you said that, since it all sort of opened up after 1995, clearly after you said Shaolin Karate and said it's grappling, and you opened it up for interrogation and creative interpretation by doing that. But they still had, as we said, this, as mentioned earlier, that bias of self-defense. If you can't let go of that element, you can't get it. If you can't get punch, block, kick out of your headspace, you're not going to get this.
I think it was, for example, the Naihanshin research. If there was other groups that were pursuing it and they'd found something that was more accurate or better or had a greater body of evidence, it wouldn't have been the case that we would have gone, well, we're doing this now. Therefore, we would have gone with it. The evidence leads, not what we want or what our personal tastes. I mean, there are other people out there. I've said that other people aren't. I haven't come across anyone pursuing the original functions of the kata, but I have found a couple of other people in different martial arts doing similar things. And one of them, just very briefly mentioned, because I know this is about Ko-do Ryu, but is a guy called Scott Park Phillips, who has researched the origins of Tai Chi and Bagua, and a massive body of evidence in historical theatre and spiritual and mediumship and religious practice as part of that theatre as well. His books are quite unbelievable, and they're really, really interesting. And that, I think, you sort of recognise that someone's going after the original meaning. There aren't any claims that we are the holders of truth or anything like that. It's that there's this massive body of research and a lot of time spent on it, which is available for anyone to come and have a look at, to read the books or come to the dojo. Keyboard warriors, who like to say, well, I just don't buy it, or that'd never work, and, carry on, But I think the reason for this podcast is to kind of build bridges with people that share similar interests. What could these kata be? Not, anything to do with ego or we've got answers or, in the greater sense or anything like that. It's a shared passion for kata, for antique forms, which are quite niche, really. Yeah.
Yes, keyboard warrior. That's interesting. Yeah, we got a lot of critics, particularly around 2006, when the myth came out. People didn't understand. I worked on, to write 400 odd pages. Nobody was paying me. The amount of time it took. People just think I'm, what was I doing? Just trying to sell something. I'm not sure if I could sell water in the desert, quite frankly. I've never been much of a salesman. I just had a passion. That's the passion we all share. Tom, it just came out in Tom then. These kata, which we loved for years, that they are something very special, and they have not had full justice done to them. And we tried to do that. So the reason for writing the book was the passion was, we've got something here. What we wanted to do as well within Ko-do as a training, as a practice, was to create, I'm not into internationalism, but we wanted to create something that transcended all the cultural stuff. We decided to keep it within a karate framework because that's such a good functional framework with a grading system and a uniform. But, we didn't need to reinvent the wheel. But we reinvented what use the wheel is put to, and that marked us out. And I don't know if you want to share anything on one of your personal pieces of work, Tom.
Yeah. Which one should I? So the Kusenku I pursued after you published The Great Karate Myth. So there was the suggestion that it might have been for the use of sai, because we couldn't find a representation of sai against a pole arm, and it seemed to be the case that the Kusenku might hold it. So I spent quite a few years looking at Kusenku, and I couldn't get it. Seemed to fit, and there was a couple of teachers in Okinawa that had suggested that Kusanku could be performed with the sai, so there might have been a little bit of an oral history there that had been passed on. So there's bits and pieces there, but in the end, it became incredibly frustrating, and it became easier to demonstrate the movements without holding the sai and to grip the bow with my hands that someone was holding. And so what eventually became the turning point was there's a movement where you drop down and you're sitting almost on one knee with one leg out, the other leg out straight. Back in the sort of mid 2000s, Shanir and I were doing some Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and there's a really nasty pin called knee on the belly. in there, and it just seemed to fit perfectly. And that really opened up the Kusanku. And as I unraveled it, I realized it was a way of taking a pole arm from someone. You're taking someone's weapon from them. And so it's essentially twisting it out of their hands. You kick to the legs, you might strike the limbs, or you barge them off of it. But it's a map, really. So if you imagine a person standing in front of you holding a bow parallel, depending on where you are, where you make contact and grab the bow, you've got this map of techniques to just get it out of their hands, basically. And that's and that kind of led on to looking at other kata. I found something similar in Pasai, but Pasai was holding on to your bow. So it became almost the counter movements to if someone tries to take your pole arm from you, how do you twist them off of it and arrive in a position where you could then use it afterwards? And so there's some real core difference, some similarities, but some core differences there. And that's how that kind of unraveled as well. But again, I don't expect anyone to believe me. What I hope is that people come and look at it and critique it and experience it and enjoy it. And that's about it. But I'm certainly not looking to make any money or get any accolade for it or anything like that. So,
Tom, yeah, earlier I did say we moved away from talking about punch, kick, striking.
Yeah.
But you did mention just then
But yeah.
striking, kicking.
Yeah.
So how are we sort of saying one thing?
it's not that the kicking and punching are the function of the form. It's that the fundamental function of Kusanku, for example, is to take someone's weapon from them, a pole arm. And it has kicks and several strikes in it that enable that function. So it's not that I'm saying that Kusanku is a way of ballistically exchanging kicks and trading blows with someone. I'm not saying that at all. The fundamental function is to grab the weapon and get it out of their hands. And sometimes you might use a kick or a barge or an elbow, something like that, just to enable that function. So we don't use that in our own karate practice, but it's just something that's there in the antique kata. So there are obviously kicks. They're all maigeri. There's nothing else. And it only appears a few times across the body of antique forms. And Nathan's even counted that and put those numbers in his book. So that's well documented already. But yeah, it's very, very different from saying that it's a ballistic exchange or for self-defense or anything like that. And I'll just add one last point. I wouldn't say that you could then take those kick strikes and barges and then apply them in a fight or in another way. They very much exist within the Kusanku method of disarming someone, taking a pole arm from someone. They don't have a life outside of that. You couldn't take them into sparring or free fighting or anything like that. So, yeah, does that kind of think that answers? Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. That does the grabbing the thing and kicking to get them to get hold of their weapon. Yeah, makes sense.
If you see, whenever you end up in a situation where you're kind of tussling or struggling with them, it's going to be the stronger person's going to win straight away. So you immediately stack the odds in your favor by kicking them in the inside of the thigh or the knee. Not with the intention of ruining their leg or anything like that, but just to get the weapon out of their hands. And it seems to be the case that it's in a civil arrest context. So I would argue that because where those strikes are placed, it speaks to something within that context of civil arrest. If it was for, no holds barred combat or skirmishing or whatever, you could just, strike them in the face straight away. That was what you would do, or kick them in the groin, or those strikes would go to far more vulnerable areas rather than something that has restraint in it as part of the method.
You see that in the police today. That sort of same sort of thing. Same sort of
Yeah, they can use their batons on the legs and the arms and things. They can't just go and clock someone across the jaw and take out a dozen teeth. Yeah,
definitely not.
Might be timely to give a little quote. One of the luminaries, Matsumura Sokon, in 1909 to 1901, And he was the author of the Makimono Scroll. Within that, he went to Fuzhou in China twice as an envoy for the Ryukyu kingdom, which shows an association between the Ryukyuan royalty and these kata, particularly the so-called shurite or shorin ryu. Here's an excerpt, one of his written instructions to a student. This was circa 1882, in which he says, "An indomitable calmness makes subjugating an adversary effortless, yet the proper methods forbid willful violence."
Yeah.
On the whole, and that's the connection with the Ryukyu court, because we are pretty much, a lot of this material, it can be loosely and has been called palace hand. And so it's probably good to make a public apology to Tom now. It's my fault that he spent 3 years trying to work out Kusenku as a sai kata, because I'd suggested that it was, and I'm not really too unhappy. In the myth, there are pictures of me applying some sample movements from Kusenku with a sai. And I'm not unhappy that they're in there, because it's a bit like a student in an exam showing his working out. And sometimes, even if you got the answer wrong, as everyone knows, it's that, in various exams, particularly maths, you get marks for showing your working out, showing how you arrived at the conclusions. So I very much see any sort of chinks in the armor of the myth book or errors as just showing the working out, because ultimately we've got there, Tom's got there. But it also firms things up, because it also shows why the sai work really can be found in the Wei Chi. That's where because the whole system around the sai, and that's much more policing, I think, in the public or in specific circumstances. Whereas I think a lot of the shuri kata, the kusenku, and the pasai are around, I think, the palace.
Yeah. And I think what the quote that you gave from Matsumura Sokon, that approach and that kind of little piece of philosophy there or ethic is embodied in the kata as well. So what we were talking about with Kusenku, that restraint there, having some restraint, having some measure in how you go about business, is reflected in those techniques. Otherwise, you could just go berserk, couldn't you? Pick the weapon up off the floor at the end. And so there's no flailing in. Yeah, I really like that. It's a great quote. It's a great, and it speaks to what was going on in the palace, and those forms being representations of that, and that embodied restraint.
Anything you want to add, Kev?
I was only thinking about what I've seen, because my son's in the police, so he showed me how they arrest people, and it's not dissimilar to some of the Ko-do stuff in some ways. It's quite fascinating. Yeah, there's no punching people in the face. No, it's none of that. No. So
Be far easier to arrest people than that if you could.
yeah, he's had some horrible stories. I couldn't do that job. No, it's all good. I mean, it's very impressive. The research has gone into it, and the weapon stuff and the brushing hands stuff is just superb.
This practice isn't that dissimilar to what we had when we were practicing Zen Shorindo, the barefoot Zen.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot more to say about that as well. So I think that you briefly mentioned when we do the Tai Chi one, I've got an idea for that when we do the Tai Chi episode, and it'll be a really good way to present that little bit of Chinese history and the importance of the Boxer Rebellion, how it completely changed the face of martial arts in China. That the culture that exists there now, which started at the end of the Boxer Rebellion, is so completely different from the culture that these forms were born into and what was going on in daily life there. It's going to be a really great way to kind of get into that and to bring out the people have their very, very secular view of kata. So there's this idea that the antique forms are just one thing, and they're not separate from the spiritual and cultural traditions and practices of their time as well, which is going to be, so to talk about Tai Chi will be a useful inroad to that, because still exploring those ideas with the antique kata myself. And it's a nice way to tie in the barefoot Zen and And we can talk about Shaolin as well. I think there's a great potential to do an episode on Shaolin. So got plenty to say about that. Do you know the first documented mention of an unarmed martial art at Shaolin was the 8 Drunk Immortals form, and it was taken directly from Chinese opera.
Yeah.
The Shaolin monastery and the Buddhist monasteries had their own theatres built in to the temples. So their first mention of an unarmed form, empty hand combat, is stage combat. So there's loads of really juicy stuff in there.
And that's why it's still popular.
Yeah, well, I mean, watch Jackie Chan do the 8 Drunk Immortals form. It's absolutely unbelievable. I mean, that's what they were doing on the stage. I mean, you can't help but be, when you see someone do that in front of you, it's unbelievable. So, yeah, there's plenty to say on that stuff.
I could talk about it all evening. I won't, because we'll sign up.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, that's all the time we have, gents. So today we've discussed the meaning of Ko-do Ryu, its origins, and touched on the research side. In a future episode, we will explore the everyday practice we promote and how its ethos is similar to when the group was called Chandao Kung Fu or Zen Shorindo Karate. This practice remains true to the intentions of Nathan's Barefoot Zen publication. We're not claiming ours is the best or only way to practice and apply karate kata for the modern consumer. Just as modern karate styles have creatively interpreted antique kata for conditioning, competition, fighting, dueling and defense, with the exception of Naihanshin, Ko-do Ryu's practice of Ko-do Tote is Nathan's creative interpretation of antique kata, rooted in the philosophy and spiritual culture to divide and transcend internal conflict. Thank you for listening to Great Karate Myths, Debunking the Legends. If you've enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, follow, or leave a comment to help keep the dojo lights on. Thank you.